Welcome to the chosen ones. Every tyrant fulfills their prophecies. Yours just wore sneakers and had no tolerance for BS. There comes a moment when the villain encounters the one soul they can't influence, scare, or control, the bully who controlled the whole room. Finally, he comes across someone who isn't interested in theatrics. That person is you, the chosen one. And let us be clear, they did not just tamper with the wrong person. They sparked a heavenly retaliation, which they will be spiritually digesting for the rest of their lives. According to studies, most bullies do not quit when someone fights back harder. They halt when someone looks through them. And that's what set you apart. You were not attempting to win a yelling battle. You were destroying a whole illusion. They assumed you were simply another silent target. They had no clue. You were not designed for submission. You were created for collision. Let's start with some comedy, shall we? They were so used to dominating the story. They assumed you were going to fold like a napkin. But instead, you arrived with the spirit of try Jesus, not me. So brace up, because this is more than simply facing a bully. This is about what happens when someone who is accountable to a higher authority becomes the last checkpoint on a dangerous power trip. Let's get to it. Number 1, they want power, but you were impervious to their terror tactics. Most individuals may not know that bullies are more than simply noisy. They are computed. They observed individuals before hitting. They choose their targets based on one factor: who seems to be the most likely to succumb, who is uncomfortable with conflict, and who is terrified of being misunderstood, stigmatized, or left alone. This is how bullies keep control. They take advantage of the dread that most people hold in quiet. But then they met you, and their system broke when they attempted to use their regular techniques. Something unexpected occurred. You did not respond like everyone else did. You did not flinch, freeze, or fumble. You stood still, looked them in the eyes, and did nothing. Not because you were afraid, but because you were reading them when they believed they had power. You were already 10 steps ahead, discreetly deciphering everything, including their anxieties, craving for attention, and addiction to domination. You saw it. You didn't have to raise your voice. Your enthusiasm did the job. Bullies are masters of terror. They talk in a tone meant to penetrate confidence. They utilize hyperbole, gaslighting, humiliation, and other tactics to sway the audience in their favor. However, they cannot manage someone who is immune, someone who has previously gone through worse, someone who does not need a crowd to feel validated. That's you. You didn't just refuse to be shook. You saw through them, which bothered them more than any insult could. What terrifies a bully is not physical strength. It's called emotional sovereignty. It's someone who doesn't need to justify their value since their presence speaks for itself. They're used to feeding on people's emotions. But you gave them none. You allowed them to drown in their own cacophony. That's when they discovered the actual power in the room didn't come from their loudness. It was your calm. And this is the bit they didn't expect. You were not frightened of being hated. You didn't require permission. You weren't playing the social game. They were attempting to incite anarchy. But you arrived with certainty. One move from you, and they discovered that intimidation only works on those who have not mastered their own strength. You had nothing to prove yet. Everything changed the minute you refused to dance to their music. They believed they were in control of the show. It turns out you were simply letting them converse before closing the drapes. Number 2, you dispelled the myth that stillness implies safety. Bullies flourish in quiet. Not theirs, but everyone else's. It's their favorite playground. They rely on individuals being too hesitant to speak out, too uncertain of themselves, and too fearful to shake the table. They rely on their victims to keep silent long enough for them to maintain control. To be honest, it often works. People remain quiet because they have been taught that speaking up would only make matters worse. That keeping your head down is the best strategy for fitting in and being safe. But then you arrived, and the mood transformed. You did not merely shatter the stillness. You unveiled what was hidden inside it. You did not talk with the intention of causing trouble. You spoke because the truth was suffocating under the falsehoods. What made things worse for them? You were not shouting. You were not emotional. You remained cool, grounded, and terrifyingly clear. That's why your voice sounded strange. They weren't prepared for someone who wouldn't protect themselves, but revealing the whole apparatus. You weren't just calling them out. You were revealing the whole system of manipulation, and they despised every second of it. People around you began to feel it, too. Those who were terrified started to wake up. They began repeating events in their brains, questioning what they had accepted as normal. That's the trouble with your truth. It didn't just liberate you. It began to shake the shackles off other individuals. And that's what made you so dangerous. They attempted to shut you down after that. Discredit, isolate, and manipulate your remarks. Because when a bully realizes their fantasy is failing, they panic. They rush to retake control. But you had already changed the dynamic. Your presence grew threatening. Not because you were loud, but because you were no longer terrified. That is what silence is meant to preserve. The bully's comfort zone. But as you talked, the enchantment shattered. And it wasn't just for 1 minute. It was due to the ripple effect. You taught them that remaining silent to maintain the peace is what allows chaos to thrive. You weren't attempting to be heroic. You were simply done pretending everything was okay. And in doing so, you encouraged everyone else to ask the questions they were too afraid to ask. That is power number 3. You did not clap back. You destroyed their spiritual leverage. They used all of the typical methods on you, including guilt, mind games, passive-aggressive remarks, and sharp-edged phony compliments. The same methods that worked for everyone else. But this time, it backfired. They didn't realize you weren't simply another individual attempting to endure the situation. You were made for this. You weren't responding to emotions. You were using discernment. They attempted manipulation, but you had something far more harmful. Clarity. Bullies frequently rely on confusion. They want you to mistrust yourself and second-guess what you heard. I'm wondering whether you're simply overly sensitive. That's how they maintain control, turning their poor actions into an imagined response. However, when they attempted it with you, they ran into a wall. You did not fall into the trap. You weren't drawn by their repetitive reasoning or emotional bait. You did not argue. You evaluated. That shook them. You didn't match their intensity. You diverted it. You were not just blocking assaults. You would undermine the exact system that gave them power. Without raising your voice, you were giving them a lesson. Real power does not have to be loud. It doesn't matter who can argue better. It's about who sees through the charade and refuses to participate. That was your only move, and it was enough. What struck them the hardest was not your words. It was your energy. You conducted yourself as if you didn't need their praise, validation, or bogus peace offerings. You didn't need to win the transaction since your spirit had already determined that you weren't for sale. You do not negotiate your self-esteem. You were not there to get even. You were there to draw the line. And that was when everything changed. You didn't just shut them down. You showed the hollowness underneath their power. They understood they were up against more than just one individual. They were up against someone with spiritual power. You didn't reply to the insult. You were facing the root. That isn't simply power. That is spiritual warfare. They learned the hard way. Bullying those who want to be loved is simple, but attempting to control someone who is already free is a nightmare. Number 4. They preyed on the injured. But you'd already bled and lived. They thought they had you figured out. Bullies always do. They seek for those who seem overly calm, polite, or friendly, thinking that must indicate weakness. They search for agony. They are capable of twisting wounds. They may tap into vulnerabilities. They can magnify. That is their blueprint. Find a person who has been injured, then take advantage of the softness left behind. But they didn't understand you'd previously gone to hell and returned without losing your soul. You weren't just bearing pain. You carried wisdom chiseled from it. They misunderstood your peaceful demeanor for dread. What they overlooked was the reality that you had already been shattered, maybe more than once. Instead of being broken, you transformed every fracture into armor, making you a new kind of danger. Not the loud and pushy one. They may easily provoke. But the quiet warrior understands what true pain is like and refuses to let anybody take them there again. They attempted the same techniques. They probed at your past. They sought to exploit what you had endured against you. But they didn't realize that your narrative isn't a disgrace. It is your strength. You did not conceal your scars. You wore them with quiet power. And when they attempted to extract blood, they discovered healed skin. When they attempted to trigger you, you didn't flinch. That was when they began to feel apprehensive. You were not frightened of pain. You got it. They were used to individuals who gave up, broke down, or pleaded for peace. But you did not do any of it. You did not need to be saved. You didn't feel frightened by the pandemonium. You'd previously confronted worse devils than them, and they believed they were the danger. But, in fact, you were the warning. And when they learned their typical techniques had no effect on you, they panicked. Not because you damaged them, but because you were unable to experience the same level of pain as others. You were no longer prey. You'd already bled and lived. That made you someone they couldn't beat. Number 5. You show their power as performance rather than substance. They base their whole identity on being feared. The loudness, the attitude, the arrogant assurance. It was all geared to make people believe they have authority. For a time, it worked. They didn't even need to do much. The possibility of being targeted was enough to keep everyone in line. People changed their tone, walked on eggshells, and remained little in order to avoid being the next victim. But then you stepped in and didn't flinch. You didn't play along, and the illusion began to disintegrate. You didn't match their aggressiveness. You did not engage in the game of one-upmanship or insult trading. You just stood solid in your presence. And they despised it. Because bullies do not thrive on strength. They thrive on obedience. Their dominance does not exist until you believe it. And when you didn't, the mask slid off. Suddenly, their outgoing attitude became dramatic. Their warnings seemed hollow. The dread they depended on had nowhere to go. And without it, they seemed smaller. What made things worse for them was that you didn't even have to raise your voice. You didn't need to prove anything. Your stillness revealed all they were attempting to conceal. Your quiet let everyone else realize how theatrical their power really was. People started to notice what you saw. Someone urgently attempting to dominate the story since they lacked a strong foundation. It was all posture and loudness. You presented the room something that most people never get to see. That power based on fear requires license to exist. And when that authorization is revoked, the whole edifice falls. That is just what you accomplished by refusing to bow. You reminded everyone watching that power does not derive from intimidation. It stems from the truth. They had none. After then, the atmosphere shifted. The tension changed. They were aware that the grasp on the room had weakened. Because if you stop surrendering, you will cease feeding the falsehood. And what remains is a loud voice with no roots. That was what shocked them the most. Not that you fought back, but you didn't have to. You did not fight their force. You disclosed that it never ever existed. Number 6, they engaged in psychological games. But you were the mastermind of mental resilience. They assumed they were playing chess with someone who had just learned the rules. They didn't understand you'd previously been through psychological warfare that would have devastated most individuals. People you loved had lied to you, betrayed by someone you trusted, gaslit, until you questioned your own memories, your own voice, your own value. So when they arrived with their twisted mind tricks, you weren't perplexed. You were previously trained. You didn't only learn to withstand manipulation. You investigated its origins. You grasped the patterns, the traps, and the emotional minefield. They arrived with strategies, believing they were brilliant. But you'd previously examined similar strategies in individuals who were more sophisticated, deadly, and near to your heart. So when they attempted to sow seeds of doubt in your mind, you didn't water them. Instead, you destroyed them. They couldn't read you in the same way they did. Others, because you weren't driven by ego. You were transitioning from consciousness. They attempted to elicit your emotions, but your replies were anchored in discernment. They asked you to seek clarification from them, but you already had it within. This is what made you untouchable. They weren't simply up against one individual. They were up against an opponent who had conquered the battlefield inside themselves. Your mental toughness was not developed in a week. It stemmed from years of trying to find out what was genuine. When the world around you keeps changing the facts, you had to restore your self-esteem brick by brick after it had been ripped apart. So, no, they couldn't undo you since you'd already sewed yourself back together in private. That is not simply strength. That is mastery, and the bit they didn't see coming. Your mere presence began to cause changes that they were unable to understand. You weren't only negotiating mental conflict. You were disrupting generational trends in real time. You were not responding to them. You were eliminating the system that had produced them. They assumed they were playing with your imagination, but you were holding a blueprint. They were unable to read and walked with an inner power they were unaware of. They brought games. You brought a legacy. They caused pandemonium. You provided clarification, and they won't forget it. Seventh, you made it apparent that you would rather be disliked than controlled. You made them uncomfortable without trying by refusing to play the role they scripted for you. Most individuals fold the instant strain arises. They prioritize being liked above being respected. They contract themselves, bite their tongues, not along, just to avoid unsettling the boat. And this is precisely what bullies and manipulators rely on. People who dread disagreement more than they cherish their own self-esteem. But you were different. You did not have to be liked to feel strong. You didn't need their permission to understand who you are and why you're dangerous. They gave you tranquility, but it came at a price. Your quiet, your obedience, your willingness to pretend everything was okay when it wasn't. And that was the moment everything changed. You didn't just reject their offer. What did you disclose it for? It really was a trap. A cheap trade disguised as harmony. They were used to folks playing along, faking just enough to live. But you chose truth over comfort. And this threw them totally off. You weren't scared to lose people if it meant preserving yourself. You did not compromise yourself in order to be included. You did not adjust your tone to be more appealing. And when they turned you down, you didn't beg to be let back in. You walked away as if you knew you were never intended to belong in situations that needed self-betrayal. That is not simply strength. That is freedom. They weren't sure what to do with someone who wasn't frightened of being misunderstood. Someone who does not mind being labeled tough. Too much intensity. Labels did not frighten you. Lies did. So you kept it genuine. Even if it made others uncomfortable. That's what shook them. You were not striving to be loved. You were attempting to remain whole. And, while others were bending to remain in the room, you walked out with your dignity intact. You helped them understand that control is only effective for those who are afraid of rejection. But you wore rejection as armor. You made it apparent that you would rather be despised than managed. They were unable to touch you after that. Number 8, you did not compete for attention. You strode with authority. They were accustomed to the commotion, people speaking loudly in order to be taken seriously. People over-explain themselves. People compete to be seen, heard, and validated. That's the climate in which they flourished, where the need for approval made it simple to dominate the room. But you arrived differently. You were not vying for attention. You were not striving to show your value. You were not interested in being accepted by those who required a show to appreciate you. And this is what made them worried. Your presence attracted attention without asking for it. They misread your peaceful assurance for arrogance. They insulted your serenity, as if it were a weakness. They could sense it, however. There was something in you that did not move like the others. You weren't seeking influence. You embodied it. You did not speak to compete. You talked with someone. Correct. You were not attempting to climb a ladder. You were the interruptions designed to shake the whole system. And once they discovered you weren't attempting to impress anybody, it was clear you weren't there to be liked. You were there on assignment. That is what separated you. You did not proclaim your authority. You stepped into it. You did not need titles, following, or accolades to legitimize your donation. It simply poured from you easily and effortlessly. This made those who were performing for clout feel vulnerable. Because, while others were trying their best to seem strong, you were doing the least. Still in charge of the room. They couldn't figure you out since you didn't need their validation. You didn't play by the same rules. You have nothing to prove since your authority was not derived from individuals. It stemmed from the wars you endured, the truth you carry, and the purpose you live by every day. And no matter how much they tried to dismiss you, the energy did not lie. They saw it when you stepped in. They sensed it when you talked. You did not compete for a seat. You were the table. You did not demand respect. You embodied it. And soon, even the loudest ones went quiet because they discovered something profound. You weren't just in the room. You were assigned to shift it. Number 9. You did not just win. You altered the atmosphere. It wasn't simply a victory. It marked a turning point. Because when you stood up to them, something deeper occurred. It wasn't only you that pushed back. It wasn't about trying to seem powerful or have the final word. It was the enthusiasm you carried while doing it. That calm, solid, irrefutable presence that said, "I know who I am, and I will not let this go." That's what changed everything. You were not loud. You were not dramatic. You didn't need a backup. But the instant you stood firm, the air became heavy. People who had been quiet now leaned in, not simply to observe, but because something inside them was awakening. You did not just make a point. You turned into a mirror. People saw themselves in you. They realized what they had permitted and accepted. How many times had they sat in the same circumstance and said nothing to maintain the peace? But you were not there for peace. You were there for the truth. Bullies understand how to read energy, too. That is why they panicked. They sensed the change before anybody said anything. Because when you walked in truth, the terror that they used to manipulate people vanished. They were no longer the dominant force in the room. You were. But not because you dominated them physically. You reset the whole dynamic spiritually. That's the thing. You were not just facing a person. You were encountering a pattern, a cycle. A long-standing environment made quiet seem safe. You broke it. You revealed it. Without attempting, you gave everyone watching permission to remember who they are. People did not clap. They did not cheer, but they could feel it. Something in them changed, and some went home that day and made other decisions. Set limits. I spoke out. What did they walk away from? They no longer serve them. Not because you urged them to, but because your daring restored their belief in their own abilities. You did not only win a personal struggle, you have activated a room. And it is the type of effect bullies cannot erase because it does not stop when the time passes. It echoes number 10. Their disguise did not slip. You pulled it off. Bullies understand how to play roles. They put on a charm, play the victim, behave as leaders, or seem to care. Whatever works best at the time. Everything is a ruse. They create an image that conceals who they really are so that they may continue influencing others without being confronted. And most people fall for it because the surface seems plausible. But not you. You were not misled by the act. You were not looking at what they presented. You were listening to what they were carrying. You saw through it. While everyone else was responding to their tone of voice or how they phrased their statements, you were paying attention to what their energy was communicating. You didn't require them to say anything incorrect to point it out. You felt it. That type of wisdom is not derived from gossip or hearsay. It comes from understanding the truth so thoroughly that everything phony seems different in your presence. So when you talked, it was not an assault. It was a revelation. You didn't go out of your way to embarrass them, but when you pointed out what they were really doing, their whole charade came apart. They were unprepared for it. They were accustomed to influencing how others saw them. But you didn't look with your eyes. You were witnessing with spiritual clarity. And this is what made it so perilous for them. They could not keep the mask on. Once you were inside the chamber, your presence made it hard to lie effectively, not because you shamed them in front of others, but because you interrupted the energy that kept them alive. You did not require a stage. Your reality struck at a level where masks are ineffective, whereas spiritual honesty reveals what titles and social attractiveness attempted to conceal. You did not come to destroy them. You came to expose what was already decaying underneath. You didn't simply release yourself. You made it difficult for them to conceal from anybody ever again. Because once a mask is removed, it never fits properly again. A number. You refused to idolize their influence. They were used to people folding in their presence. People who are captivated by powerful titles, attention, or influence. People who reduce their standards only to be in someone else's shadow. People who see closeness to status as indication of worth. That was what they were banking on. Your need for affirmation, your quiet in return for access. However, they made a significant error in their calculations. You did not flinch. You did not flatter. You didn't pretend to grin merely to remain in their good graces since you weren't fascinated by their appearance. You weren't duped by the dazzle, the stage, or the following who repeated their words like scripture. You saw everything for what it was. Glasses dressed up like gold. A well-crafted picture with no actual substance to it. They misread your silence for intimidation. But the reality is, you were unmoved. You were not frightened because you were unimpressed. That's what broke their armor. Because individuals like that thrive on adulation. They rely on the idea that they are untouchable. Better choices. And when you didn't participate, When you didn't laugh at the proper moment or nod on cue, people saw the difference. You upended the script. You did not come to be impressed. You arrived with discernment. And discernment understands what filters and charm cannot conceal. You did not come with jealousy. You arrived with X-ray eyesight. You were not bitter. You were merely awake. You didn't mind how many people liked them. You were concerned about who they really were when no one was looking. And as you watched, it got apparent. What they dubbed leadership was really manipulation. What they referred to as confidence was really performance. And it surprised them since they'd never encountered somebody who couldn't be swayed by the performance. You did not offend them. You simply did not adore them. And that alone made you the public enemy number one. Because when individuals like them can't control how others see them, they lose control. You were not lured to the crown. You were observing the character underneath it. You didn't look away when you witnessed the decay. You stood steadfast. They couldn't manage so much electricity. A number. You became the unanticipated outcome. They believed they were untouchable. They have done it many times before. Bully, belittle, manipulate, and then walk away clean. No responsibility, no resistance. Just a long line of disturbed individuals. Too scared or broken to fight back. That was the pattern. And it worked. Until it didn't. Until you show up. They assumed you were simply another easy victim, another name to add to their list. But they didn't realize you weren't here to play the game. You were here to put a stop to it. You weren't merely a person with limits. You were someone with heavenly authority. Your mere presence interrupted what they believed they had perfected. You did not reply out of ego. You replied out of alignment. You were not responding to them. You were answering a call beyond their comprehension. That is why they could not understand it. That's why their normal techniques didn't work this time. They weren't simply messing with a person. They sparked a spiritual reaction. You were the unanticipated outcome of their actions. They had scorned the concept of justice for so long that they forgot it might look like you. Quiet, steady, clear, not vindictive but firm, not loud but unmistakable. You did not want retribution. You became the mirror, and when they attempted to ruin you, they unintentionally revealed themselves. It wasn't just about the encounter. That was what happened. People who used to support them began to look at them differently. The mask did not fit anymore. The story they crafted about being the victim began to crumble because your reality had weight. It lingered. It opened the eyes. Even those who used to support them had to confront the painful reality that they were a part of something awful. They assumed they were just dealing with one guy, but you were supported by something far larger. When they attempted to silence you, they awoke to force. They could not manipulate. And now the rippling effect will not cease. You stood rather than battled. You were the shift, the disturbance, the spiritual reminder that injustice never has the last word. They assumed they could go on as usual. But this time, you were an exception. You were the outcome, and they didn't see it coming. A number. They mistook compassion for weakness and paid with spiritual money. They assumed they had you figured out the moment you offered them grace. You were courteous. You give them the benefit of the doubt. You listened more than you said. And in their minds, it meant one thing: weakness. They saw your generosity as a sign that you could be pushed about, that you'd let things go, and that you'd silently absorb their disdain, as so many others had done. They had no understanding why you were so nice. Your benevolence was not based on naivete. It was fashioned by anguish. Through betrayal, years of learning to choose empathy without losing oneself. They didn't know your limits weren't soft. They were sacrosanct. When they crossed them, they didn't simply meet a frustrated person. They faced spiritual repercussions. You did not curse them out. You did not lose control. You did not fight dirty. However, what you did was worse for them. You answered with an uncomfortable calm that rocked their spirits. You maintained your line without shouting. You conducted yourself with such clarity that they were forced to face their own depravity. You were not emotional. You were precise. And in a culture that demands vengeance, your reluctance to sink to their level became the worst condemnation of all. They thought they could get away with it since you were pleasant. But they didn't grasp that true generosity does not accept wickedness. It exposes it. You were not their doormat. You were their mirror. And when they looked at you, they saw all they had attempted to conceal. That is why they responded so fiercely. This is why they spiraled. because they couldn't influence someone who was already in control of their emotions. You did not punish them cruelly. You punished them by being present. You allow your honesty to speak for itself. You let the truth hang in the air until it convicted every part of them. They attempted to stay concealed. Whether they confessed it or not, they felt it strongly. Because when someone attempts to violate divine energy and fails, the consequences are always spiritual rather than public. They paid for it not with shame or exposure, but with something more substantial. The loss of control over someone who refuses to allow kindness to be exploited against them. They never anticipated to pay that price. A number. You were their last warning before divine intervention. They assumed it was simply another day, another individual to dominate, demean, and manipulate. Business as usual. They'd been doing it for years, perhaps decades, with no consequences. Every time they got away with anything, their ego rose. Each victim they silenced made them feel more powerful. They thought they were untouchable. That karma was a fallacy, and God, if he existed, was not paying attention. But then they crossed paths with you, and that's when the plot altered. You were not just another target. You were a wonderful setup, not sent to punish, but to warn them, to give them one more opportunity to turn back, to check their heartbeat, stop destroying other people's life. But they didn't notice it. They assumed you were weak. They assumed your grace meant they may keep playing their old pastimes. They didn't realize you were the last line, the last halt before divine intervention. When they attempted to oppress you, they did not target a specific individual. They arrived for the wrong reason. They sparked something old and divine, because you were picked not only to live, but also to expose them, not for power, not for vengeance, but to draw a line in the sand. And once they passed that boundary, it was out of your control. God took control, and everything changed. Suddenly, everything began to come apart around them. What they had constructed on manipulation started to fracture. Relationships failed. Secrets appeared. Peace departed. Doors banged closed. And it did not make sense to them. But you knew, because heaven always reacts when injustice strikes a vessel. God has anointed. You were not the penalty. You were the last opportunity to halt the punishment. They'll look back and understand they weren't simply teasing someone. They rejected divine kindness. You were the mirror, the moment, the message. And when they didn't listen, the consequences were not yours to bear. It was God's. That is what shook them. That is what humiliated them. Because messing with someone who walks with divine favor does not simply result in a loss of power. You lose your protection. They will remember you not because you fought back, but because things began to fall apart after you left the room. They felt they were dealing with someone ordinary, someone they could manipulate into quiet and go away unharmed. But they didn't understand you weren't simply another passerby. You were a heavenly interruption, a line in the sand, a spiritual reckoning manifested in human form. You didn't respond to their madness with disorder. You did not descend to their level. You stood in clarity as others rushed to defend their delusions. You had scars they couldn't identify since they'd never had to go through what you did. And this made you unshakable. They attempted to control your mind, but you had already learned your bit. They attempted to weaponize your generosity, but your limits were forged of fire. They noticed your calm and believed they had you, but your silence was their undoing. Every action you took revealed something deeper. You demonstrate their strength via performance. You refused to feed their egos. You did not retaliate. You have disclosed. You did not just stand up for yourself. You stimulated others. You didn't have to win the debate. Your mere presence altered the environment. You did not come to play their game. You arrived to complete the pattern. And what they dreaded most came true. They lost their grasp. Not because you fought dirty, but because you moved with integrity. Because you remained firm while others bowed. Because you were picked not just to survive the encounter, but to break the pattern. Allow them to speak. Let them twist. Allow them to pretend nothing changed. Because, at the end of the day, people will remember you as the catalyst for change. The one who did not flinch. The one who did not play along. The one who brought justice without having to yell. You were never just a response. You were the answer from a world they are unable to reach. And it is what made all the difference. If this message moved you deeply, do not let it end here. Hit the subscribe button to join a community that sees through the noise, speaks the truth, and walks with true authority. I like this video. If you understand what it means to be the storm that breaks the stillness, leave a comment and let your experience be heard, because your voice has power and your breakthrough might be someone else's confirmation. Also, share this video with someone who needs a reminder. They were not feeble. They were hardwired for battle. This isn't just content. This is confirmation. It's a revelation. It is the fuel for individuals called to break darkness without raising a voice. So be focused, brave, and chosen, for the world has been operating on illusions for far too long. And your presence? This is the reset. Subscribe today. Your light is not just required. It's divinely planned. God bless you.